let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Claire Taylor and I'm the Visual Arts Coordinator for the Salt Lake City Arts Council. And one of my main roles is managing the Finch Lane Gallery. And currently we are exhibiting the work of Elpitha Tsoutsounakis, her exhibition Unknown Prospect, Body Pigment Swatch. And we are excited to have an exhibition lecture with her here today. I'm going to give a quick introduction for Elpitha, and then I'll turn the time over to Elpitha. Elpitha Tsoutsounakis is a Cretan American designer, letterpress printer, and educator based in so-called Salt Lake City, Utah. She is an assistant professor and founding faculty in the multidisciplinary design program at the University of Utah, where she teaches design studios, research methods, and visual strategy. She completed her Bachelor of Science in Architecture at the University of Utah and her Master's of Architecture at the University of Texas at Austin. Her work has been published in local and international publications. Through her research in pigment, she has developed an international community. And in her local community, she has served as Vice President for the AIGA Salt Lake Chapter and Chair of Salt Lake Design Week. Her creative practice in ochres is multi-layered, just as ochres create layers in geologic history. She engages issues of design ethics, materiality, ecofeminism, and the human relationship to the more than human. And it is my pleasure to turn the time over to Elpitha.
Hi, Claire. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for setting this up today and facilitating all of the sharing and broadcasting. I'm excited to talk to you all about my work. My name is Elpitha. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining you from my studio over in the Avenues in Salt Lake City. I have a lot of thoughts, and this work has been ongoing for several years, and the exhibition is really complex. So I could talk for hours and hours about this. So hopefully I can give you a brief glimpse into certain aspects of what I was thinking about in creating the exhibit and what the sort of main ideas are of the research behind it, and some maybe next steps. But I also have a few glimpses into the process of how we put it all together as well. I also want to introduce Megan Pettit, who's here with us today. She is my research assistant. She's a senior in the design program at the University of Utah, the Division of Multidisciplinary Design, I should say, and Kevin Howard, who is also a research assistant in TA, who graduated this past fall from design. And they have both really been so wonderful in participating in this work, helping me research, being out in the field with me, helping fabricate and install the exhibit. And so it's really been a group effort. I also want to thank Knox and Bobby and Vince and all the wonderful staff at the College of Architecture and Planning for their help in fabrication and installing the exhibit. And thanks for all of you who are joining us. Heidi, I see you, welcome. Happy to see you and happy to see you all that are here. So real quick, just to introduce what I do. I think about ochres and pigments, but I'm really investigating a design research paradigm that's thinking about research through design, or design as a process of research, research as a process of design. And so I'm really interested in design as an epistemic tool, and design as a way of knowing through heuristic methods, and knowing through making and doing. And of course, all this work is really informed by my background in architecture and printmaking and thinking about design process. And first and foremost, I think that we should acknowledge that the place that we are in now, if you are in the United States or in many places throughout the world, are the ancestral territories and living current territories of Indigenous peoples. And I think that it's important to say that acknowledgement is just no longer enough. I guess I have this sort of long history of kind of questioning what an acknowledgement means, and whether or not I'm doing it right. I think first and foremost to understand that there are tribes with ties to these lands who are here still living in these lands. It's not just past, but it's current and future. And so I'm constantly thinking about my relationship to that as an immigrant or as a settler, and my relationship to that through my work. And so one of the wonderful opportunities has been to think about these landscapes through ochres, but to understand the relationships and narratives and histories and worlds that they reveal that are otherwise not typically seen. And I think that we have a responsibility to think about that through all of our work and our daily living and practicing in these places, even if it's not explicitly, out in the desert, like this view here of the San Rafael Swell. I'm also thinking about a lot of things in terms of extraction, and I am critical of extraction, but I'm also realistic in the fact that, I have a phone, and these materials have been extracted from somewhere, and someone else's somewhere. And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't take anything, but I also think that we need to be critical about what these relationships are. Through my practice, I think about assembling ochres from the landscape, but also being with ochres. And so sometimes it's not about taking or picking things up, but about actually understanding these materials, learning who they are, learning their being, and learning what they would like to communicate with us. And so oftentimes I don't even pick up ochres, I leave them where they are. But this is an ongoing relationship. And just to touch on some of the ethics of what I'm about to show you in terms of collecting pigments from the landscape, I'm really conscious of where I pick up materials. Because really what I'm doing is a form of extraction on a very small scale, right? My one individual person walking on the land. But I'm very careful to pick up ochres from washes where the materials are otherwise already turned up from water and floods, road cuts, which have already been disturbed. And the picture that we're looking at here is of the San Rafael Swell. There's tons of roads that have been cut for mining, for grazing, and for extraction. And so road cuts are often a useful way of digging into layers that have been revealed by that intervention, and specifically tailings and waste piles. And I came to my interest in tailings because of my history as a Greek immigrant, a Cretan immigrant here in Salt Lake City. And our community is based here because of mining. The initial waves of immigrants from Crete and Greece came in order to work in the mines throughout Bingham, Price, Carbon County. And so thinking about ochres, it's not just about color or just about, in fact, it's sort of not about color at all, but it's really a way of thinking about materiality and being introduced to this material, iron, and where it comes from. But the bigger picture is thinking about when I'm collecting ochres from landscapes, thinking about the dualisms that exist in these places. I understand dualisms from the theorist Val Plumwood, who describes sort of 5 aspects of dualisms, but really it's a binary relationship that is also negotiated through power and through an uneven or unequal distribution of power, so that human might have power over non-human or might manipulate or take advantage of non-human in this case. And I think that mining, grazing, and even recreation are all extractive industries that have this dualistic relationship to what other pluriversal kind of narratives might exist in these places. Oftentimes when I'm researching, I find the dominant or upfront priority sort of narrative, the colonial narrative of mining or grazing or recreation or pioneer heritage. But when you dig further, you start to understand stories and narratives about what Marisol de la Cadena might call the anthroponaut scene, those that are sort of impossible in their relationship to the colonial standard narrative. So these are kind of the bigger theory ideas that I'm thinking about and trying to draw and map through work with the ochres and the relationships to these landscapes. I guess I would also just say that, the USGS is a really important precedent in this, because on one hand, I think it's magnificent and so amazing that you can look through 150 years of beautiful geological pamphlets and drawings and data and resource. But I also think that that work, that scientific work or that scholarship has been really used to create commodities out of terrestrial beings. And I think that that relationship should be interrogated. And, furthermore, our relationship with the commodification of natural beings or terrestrial beings should be interrogated, and that perhaps design is complicit in all that. And I mean, not perhaps, design is complicit in all that, but perhaps through design, we can start to think about creating new relationships and new paths forward. So ochre itself is this magical thing that I might try to distill down to a few minutes. I want to thank Heidi Gustafsson for being here. She is my ochre mentor and has introduced me to this work and a lot of these understandings, and I continue to explore this with her. But ochre is an iron oxide. There are other cultures around the world and throughout time that consider ochre to be other earth materials, but my understanding specifically deals with iron oxide, and iron oxide is specifically iron that is bonded with oxygen in the environment. Iron is really fascinating because it's the most common element by mass. Our core and the Earth's core and mantle is mostly iron, but it's the 4th most common element in the crust. So you can find ochres, and ochre exists everywhere. It's right outside your doorstep, right underneath your feet. But it's not always in the most accessible form. Oftentimes you see rocks that have a lot of color and they have trace pigments in them, but they're majority silica. And so if you were to try to grind or crush those materials, you would end up with just gray, right? It's not always sort of pure pigment that's easy to work with or easy to access. But iron, I think, is just really so magical because of where it comes from and how it moves through our world. It's born in ancient supernovas. So it's the sort of literal stellar corpses of ancient stars. And it has this massive, I mean, deeper than deep geological time, or maybe perhaps bigger than we could even imagine in our human brains. But it has this massive scale in time and place. And that ochre makes its way through the universe and through time and eventually becomes the earth, and initially is sort of in solution and has not yet interacted with oxygen. But as these proto beings, pharophagic beings, meaning they're these little organisms that eat iron, excrete oxygen as a waste, and that oxygen then over millions and millions of years mixes with the iron and creates the red planet that we know now as Earth. I know you think of Mars as the red planet, but I mean Earth as the red planet. And ochre has every spectrum and hue of color. It produces a wide variety of color. So I'm particularly interested in places throughout our landscape that have a mining history, and then thinking about iron in specific in those landscapes and the history of iron and what it can reveal to us. So this is a picture here from Tintic on the left of a particular structure where you can see how perhaps the ancient pyrite structure turned into iron oxide or ochre as the water seeped through there and created these geological processes. And on the right, you see a glimpse into the museum of the actual ochre bodies on display with the prints behind them. Let's see. So those ochres that we just looked at are specifically from this pile. It's a tailings pile by the side of the road. It's really, mundane and insignificant. It's just a dirt road out in the middle of nowhere. And I'm just struck by the fact that it's so seemingly maybe sparse or seemingly not colorful, to use a real specific term, in comparison to the kinds of materials that are coming out of that pile. And that pile specifically is just a dump of waste that somebody has pulled out of the earth. My estimate is maybe 700 or 800 feet below surface, and they've dumped it there. So again, I feel like it's maybe more responsible to be taking things from that pile as opposed to the landscape adjacent to it, because it's already been dumped there by someone else. We could talk about those ethics another time, but specifically to describe how I relate to ochres is in terms of their sort of being and structure, but I'm thinking of them in terms of bodies, pigments, and swatches. And part of this exhibit is in trying to think about what those different extensions are and how I can start to organize that through my practice. So here you see bodies, which are the original sort of pieces of, but pieces is kind of not a good word, because I wouldn't think of them as discrete bodies even when they're separated from other bodies, because we know iron to be this constantly circulating thing that connects our blood to the earth throughout history. So ochre bodies might be the original materials, and then they're ground into pigments that you see here. And then I use those to create swatches. And the swatches are really interesting because they sort of become this agentic communication of the ochre. I think that the ochres communicate through their bodies, through their pigment, through their existence in the landscape. But then a whole nother dimension happens when we start to think about those colors and the resulting color and what they mean. And so here you see, these are all of the samples that I looked at from Tintic to create those 7 main prints in the exhibition. And then I swatched them because you can't really tell what happens from just the dry pigment. It changes every time you do some kind of phase change to the material. So I made all these swatches just to see what would happen, and then selected the final 7 or 8 for those prints. But I think in addition to body, pigment, and swatch, there's also sight and story that's inherent in these materials, and they can guide us and reveal different aspects of these stories and sights in the ways that we relate to them. In terms of practice, I think it's interesting just to talk about practice and ritual. And Russell, I think you're here, there you are. Russell asked me a really interesting question at one of our ochre office hours a few weeks ago in terms of like, do you think what you do is a ritual? And I guess I had never thought about it that way. I mean, I definitely think of it as a process and a practice, and every day coming here and working with something and grinding in the mortar and pestle. But I do think it's definitely a ritual also. And in fact, perhaps all of design process is a ritual. But that ritual process is about walking and then about grinding. It's really simple. And maybe it continues on to extend into printing or drawing or mapping. But the walking and grinding is the primary ritual that's happening every day. And it also connects the studio to the studio, right? So the studio here in my studio that you see, or the studio in the landscape. And I think that there are these relationships that are happening when we're doing the same ritual or design process in the studio, in the site, on the page, in community, we start to do these things over and over again, and the ritual is touching a variety of different actors and creating meaning through all of those different place relationships. And then in terms of ritual and process, just showing a glimpse into the actual making that happens with the ochres. I'm really interested not in painting images or making images with the materials. I want the ochres to sort of stand on their own and communicate for themselves. Who is it? Eduardo Kahn talks about the agency of beings and that we should not try to anthropomorphize, that's the right use of the term, how beings have agency, how non-human beings have agency, but that in fact we can understand their agency in other ways. So they don't have to talk to us, that their simple being is communicating something to us. And I am really interested in working with ochres and incorporating them into the maps and materials and prints that I'm making, the products that I'm making, so that they themselves become the form of communication. And so here in the top corner, you see the molar. And so we go from body, which is not shown here, to pigments. These pigments in the bottom right corner are all from the San Rafael swell, to then swatches. And here's an image of actually documenting those print artifacts and then using those in digital works. So in the exhibition, you'll see there's a movie film, a documentary film that I call Temple Mountain Dispatch. I think of that as a live webcam, because if you think about webcams today, there's this few second delay. And in my mind, that few second delay from like the live view on, Recapture Lodge down in Bluff right now is not so different than the 100 years between now and the time this photo was taken at Temple Mountain and the millions and billions of years that Temple Mountain has existed. And so starting to think about these moving images and the relationship between physical artifact and digital artifact to create different types of dispatches. I'm also interested in this binary code that's happening in that media because ochre and iron oxide itself has so many technological uses, right? We didn't even talk about the uses of iron oxide, but beyond pigment has a lot of different scientific uses, specifically the earliest and first recording devices that used magnetic iron oxide to do the binary recording of information. So in the exhibit, you'll see that film is a variety of these stills that you see here on the left. Those little X's are flashing in binary code to communicate dispatches from the site, again, in a live feed. And then, maybe switching gears a little bit in terms of process, but then process also comes to include a variety of different methods and practices in the shop, in the studio. These are images of us actually building the different prototypes and the exhibits. It was important for me to build the structures in the exhibits so that they could start to relate to or speak to a vernacular from the sites in a mining vernacular and language. And then also looking at all the different types of technology that we've used. So this process is about walking and grinding and about working with ochres, but it is also about thinking about the mortar and pestle or the paintbrush or the printing press, all as forms of technology. And then we can sort of fast forward to CNC router or scanning electron microscope, like that's shown up here on the top, or Rhino as a really complex software. So I'm really interested in the ritual and the process and the way in which ochres and working with ochres allows us to kind of weave in and out of all of these different types of technology, some very old, some very recent, some very analog, some very, complex. But I describe those in binaries, but I don't think of them as in terms of binaries. I think they're all forms of understanding this material and working with it and creating outputs that can help communicate the material itself, but also the narratives and the histories of these places that we're visiting. Another aspect of practice is community. And I think it's really important to be involved in community. I was listening to Anya McCausland talk yesterday. She has an exhibit at the Middlesbrough Art Museum in the UK, and she works with tailings ponds, ochres that she makes from tailings ponds and paints that she makes. And she specifically makes really mundane like house paints because she wants community members to be able to use the paints, not just artists or quote unquote artists. But she's talking about changing the transaction, and these are my words, not hers, but I really interpret her work as changing the transaction from make paint to sell paint to make paint, interact with community and build community and create these new futures through the activity of building community. So with the exhibit, it was really important to me to be able to invite people to the exhibit and talk with people and just have people try it. It's such a magical, wonderful thing, just to work with these materials and feel them for yourself and to see how different materials grind differently and how they respond differently in different ways. So every Tuesday, we've been inviting people to the gallery. Finch Lane and the Salt Lake Arts Council have been very generous in facilitating this. From 5 to 7 p.m., you can come and try it for yourself. And so tonight, just a little plug, will be the last night. Everybody run down if you haven't had a chance to come so far. I think that this is also a way of my honoring the people that taught me, Heidi here and many other wonderful people all over the world who are in this pigment community on a larger scale. I mean, people have been so generous with me to teach me about these things. So I think it's really important to share that knowledge and not, I don't know, not hide it away. Let's see. And so lastly, this is just a glimpse into the exhibit. The exhibit is organized again by body, pigment, and swatch. And so maybe here, I'm actually going to see if I can click on this and open up. Can you still see my screen? Claire, is that showing this Matterport thing? So I think that this is just such an amazing resource that the Finch has provided for us.
Oh, we can't see the Matterport. We're still seeing your slide.
Let's see. I'll just reshare. So this amazing resource. So you can actually come and check this out on the Finch Lane's website. Can you see it now? And I will try not to make you sick by zooming you around this crazy virtual space, but you can kind of see as we scroll around the 3 volumes of the exhibit. So we have volume 1, which is, oh dear, that's when I won't click on another one of those. Volume 1, which is the body and thinking about specifically the East Tintic Mining District. Volume 2, which is pigment and thinking about pigments themselves as signs and as agents. These, I'm thinking of them as tamata, which are these traditional like votive offerings in the Greek Orthodox Church that you'd see like little metal things hung on icons. And I just think it's such a lovely thing to think about pigment as votive or promise or offering. And I think of these as sort of tokens and signs throughout time and space that are interacting with ochre realms. I'm not going to zoom in there. Maybe I'll just step a little bit closer. You can see. So these materials here, these ochres have been collected from all over Utah over 3 years. There's some from Stansbury Island, Crosby Canyon, a variety of different places. This is just the catalog hanging up there, but then volume 3 is over here in the corner, and volume 3 is swatch. So thinking about the ways in which those swatches start to become the form of communication in the digital, but then also you can see the materials there on the table, the ochres and the pigments that are made from those. So that's kind of giving you a sense of what it is. And I think that's probably a good place to stop and ask questions, perhaps. Thank you.
I also want to add that if anyone's live streaming on Facebook, go ahead and you can write your questions in the chat and I'll read them off to Elpitha. Maybe I'll start with a question, Elpitha. It seems like your work touches a lot on collaboration and conversation, both with beings in the past and present. And of course, you speak of ochres as though they're beings, but it also seems like a conversation with these past miners because you're pulling from these piles. So I just wanted to, and then you're also communicating a lot and networking with other people that work with pigment currently. So I just love to hear you talk a little bit more about your collaboration and conversation with beings in the past and the present and how that works into your concepts.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it comes down to relationship, right? And reciprocity. I think I just am really interested in being in relationship with others, whether they are humans or non-humans, because I guess I just don't want to be alone, but I also don't think that any one of us in an isolated sense could tackle anything, right? And maybe it's perhaps also a response to this sort of cultural societal shift that we see that's thinking about the relationship or the difference, I should say, between individual and collective. I'm much more interested in the collective. I'm much more interested in communalism. And I think that when we focus just on the individual, it gets us into a lot of thorny problems or issues. But I am interested in collaboration, partially just because I think it's such a rich and rewarding experience of the work and the practice. And I definitely think of myself in collaboration with those old miners, or even with the ochres themselves. I was telling you how when I first installed the exhibit, I missed them from being at my house, and I would kind of drive by and wave as I drove past Finch Lane. Yeah, so I think that we should all think about being in collaboration and in community with each other.
Looks like Catherine raised her hand. Go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, so I think maybe you're already beginning to answer my question. I was thinking about the term intersubjectivity, which, those of us who work in thinking about linguistic realms, right? If I am saying a word to you and it's literally physically leaving my body and materially going in your body, even right now, right, through this technology that we're using, that obviously then my agency, my subjectivity, right, depends upon you in a very great way. So I guess I'm wondering, how you think about the agency of the ochres in relationship in a kind of, I don't know if intersubjectivity is the term you'd want to use. Obviously, in some ways, it seems to depend in part, I don't know whether you'd say this, on how we are receiving them. And then I guess the related question is, do you wish to change something about the way we who would come to the exhibit, or we who would receive their agency, would receive them?
Yes, so maybe I'll start with the end there, because absolutely, I do want everyone to shift their thinking. I think, if anything, the goal would be that we relate to all non-human materials and beings in this way, right? What if we as a society, as a global community, related to water the way I relate to ochres, or to carbon the way I relate to ochres? How would that massively upend our systems and structures, and maybe potentially even systems of inequality and injustice, right? So I am hoping that maybe perhaps people will think about materials differently as agentic beings, not just as resource or raw material. I have to admit that I don't off the top of my head know what intersubject, like I'm not super familiar with the term, but the way that you describe it makes me think of pluriversality. And this idea that instead of, it's like the one world that John Law talks about, right? The scholar John Law, that instead of all of us being in one world that's objective, and we all have different perspectives of that one objective world, that in fact, we all operate our own individual worlds. And so there's this pluriversal understanding. And to me, that seems really similar to what you're maybe suggesting with intersubjectivity, that we all have our own universe and our own objective reality, so that nothing perhaps is objective, because we could sort of start to talk in circles here about the relationships between objectivity and subjectivity. I think for me, it's not so much that someone understands what I understand from it, but that I think each person is developing their own relationship, and that we start to acknowledge that there are other universes, that there are other worlds. Because I perhaps am challenging right now the idea that in the US or in Utah or in the Colorado Plateau, in these places, we have these very dominant ideas about what those places mean, whether it's public land or mining or grazing or extraction, or if it's about recreation or rock climbing. We tend to call these things one notion of what they are, and they never acknowledge the indigenous histories there, or the indigenous relationships there, and they also tend to prioritize a certain type of activity or relationship. And so I guess that's the sort of intersubjectivity that I would hope to accomplish through some of the work, is a remapping or alternative mapping that allows for different ideas of these places. Does that answer your thought about
I could say more about intersubjectivity. I just want to make sure other folks are getting in. So great answer.
I'm going to look it up, Catherine.
I could say.
I just got a message from Camille that she has a question. Camille, go ahead.
Yeah, as I am listening to Elpitha, and as you may recall, I think I've visited your demonstration probably 3 times now there at Finch Lane. Every time it's a powerful experience. And I realized the last time I was there that part of why it is so meaningful to me is, as you were saying just now, about this sense of community, not just with our fellow humans, it was literally all that is. And about 30 years ago, I started engaging in ritual in ways that were very different from how I was raised, but that actually tapped into, I think, who I was from my earliest memories, that we are literally part of everything, which is why I self-identify, first of all, as a pagan, and lastly, as Christian, but along the way, I'm also a Sufi, and I practice a Buddhist form of meditation daily. And I don't find any conflict in any of that. But about 30 years ago, I started engaging in the rituals and ceremonies of the Sweat Lodge, and I've been doing that now for many years. And what you are articulating is exactly what we articulate. The very first thing, as we are entering the lodge, we say some version of Mitaku Oyasin, which loosely translated means, I am acknowledging all that is, we are all connected. Most people translate it into English as all my relations, but it literally means I am related to everything that is. We are all beings. We are all essentially sentient beings, including the stones that we heat to incandescent glow and then bring into the lodge. We call them the grandfathers. Literally our ancestors, which is essentially what you are referring to with the stars as our ancestors. And then those stars are expressed as the stones, and then you experience them through the ochres, the iron, and that it's all transformed one way or another with intense heat. And we have, in all of our religious and spiritual traditions, we make reference to those connections, you know, the pressure, the heat, and the refinement, and the creation and destruction, and that it's all about that wholeness. And I wondered if you have spent much time working with the native traditions here, you know, with the Ute, the Paiute, the Shoshone, and so forth, because that's exactly part of what you're making reference to.
Yeah, absolutely. I love your description of how you participate in the Christ to crystal spectrum, Camille, as my friend Cecily calls it. I think so. Yes, I think that ochre is really sort of maybe a good gateway sort of drug to non-human beings, because it's such a ubiquitous material all over the world through time that every human has had a relationship with it. And so I'm particularly interested in my own ancestral heritage in Crete, in the island of Crete, and how ochre might have been used there. I do think it's really important to acknowledge that ochre is used in our region where we are here by many indigenous peoples. And I don't know about those. I don't know a lot about those specific customs or rituals or sort of practices, partially because I'm not indigenous, but also because I'm careful to sort of kind of walk that line of appropriation and not appropriating indigenous culture and sacred rituals to do my own work. But instead, I'm really interested in the positionality that I have, right? The position that I have as an immigrant, as a white woman in so-called Salt Lake City, to look at the research and question the research, and then perhaps illustrate things about it that I think are not necessarily true or honest, or that we all have to be critical about. I do learn things about native uses or indigenous uses of ochre, but I intentionally keep that personal and maybe think about it and reflect about it and respect it with a great deal of respect, but I'm very careful not to appropriate that or put that out through my own work, if that makes sense. But I think also it's important to know that, you know, everyone has a relationship to this material and can find it depending on how deep or far or wide you look in your own position and your own identity.
Well, and then the identity of those of us who came here. My great-grandfather came across with Brigham Young. That's why I'm here. And part of what I'm working out is what my relationship here is to all of what you're making reference to.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any other questions for Elpitha? You're welcome to write them in the chat and we can read them off for you. While we're waiting, Elpitha, I'm curious how working on this project has altered your relationship to time, to vast spans of time.
Yeah, I mean, greatly, right? It's altered my relationship to several of my senses. I don't think about color the same anymore. As a designer before, I maybe thought about color in terms of my interface with digital technology and Pantone colors or even color theory and Albers and Itten. But now I think about color as sort of the last thing on the table that's sort of inconsequential. I'm not curating color, but I'm instead having a relationship with a place and a being, and the color is a result, and it is what it is in a sense. But I also think that it doesn't also necessarily matter what it looks like either, because all these materials have such intense feelings when you are working with them to produce the color. And I think it's similar for time, just to think about geological time and to go to a place and think about it on the scale of millions and billions of years, as opposed to 5 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour or 3 days. Yeah, I guess in a way it sort of blurs everything together, but then also creates this hyper focus and specificity that happens within the blur. But it's a constant thing that I'm thinking about in terms of the work. Slowing down too with the materials has been really nice, just to think about the time it takes to grind pigments or to walk long distances in the landscape. And I think it's a nice relationship in terms of the digital modern lives. A lot of this work has happened right before the pandemic and throughout the pandemic. And I think, how could we not mention that life-altering thing that has happened for the last 2 years that has also altered time and the meaning of time? What does time ever even mean anymore? But I would say that some of the advantages to that time that the pandemic made for me was thinking about this work in different ways. Oh, Russell has a good question in the chat. Thanks, Russell. What is the future of this work for you? What is the future? So continuing to do the work, continuing to pick up ochres and think about ochres, and continuing to make maps. But specifically, like in the most immediate future, I'm working on creating an archive. And I'm working actually with scholars in the Digital Matters research sort of center at the University of Utah, the Marriott Library, and they have a platform called Omeka S, which is like a digital archiving platform. And I've recently just completed a grant proposal to create an online archive of pigments, and not just the pigment or the color, which, by the way, there sort of doesn't exist any good online open source resource to look at all the different types of natural pigments and their color. There are these sort of wiki pages that talk about the data and the science, but they never show the actual pigment or the source material, or talk about all of the cultural and art to design relationships, humanities relationships to those pigments. So I am thinking about this archive and working with several collaborators all over the world who are also collecting pigments to feature some of their collections and to start to create this conversation and this online open source resource. So it's a real thing, but also continuing just to walk around and pick up rocks and dirt and see where that goes. So I kind of always am I've always got like a little specific plan, and then also holding space for who knows what will happen next week. I am excited. I may say a little preview, but I am talking to the folks down at the Green River at the epicenter about maybe taking the ochres on the road for the Green River Rocks Geology Festival. So fingers crossed that all comes together. I'm really excited about the work that they're doing down there. And so maybe the exhibit will go on the road, but I will continue to work with ochres and continue to think about printing and mapping and archives.
LP, can I ask a question real quick before we go?
Please do. Welcome.
And hi, I miss you.
I miss you too.
Just because I didn't get to participate in the show or see it or visit you, I just have a more silly question, which was, what was your experience of doing the sort of afternoons with people? What did you call those? Where they would
Ochre office hours.
The office hours. I'm curious because I really like how you brought up Anya's paint becomes community as opposed to image. And curious like what that felt like for you, if that's a part of the work you want to, I don't know, that felt meaningful, or if you notice specific like embodied responses that people communicated. I know Camille mentioned a few having been there, but yeah.
Yeah.
Could you speak
Well,
to
I mean, first of all, it's just exciting to nerd out with other people about something that you're so passionate about. And what's really satisfying is just to see people's wonder and surprise and response. And I mean, just to introduce Heidi, Heidi is my dear friend and mentor who has the earlyfutures.org, which is an ochre sanctuary up in Washington. And she's been working with ochres for many years and collects ochres from all over the world. And you taught me through this particular platform, right? In coming there and working with you and learning about just by hands-on playing around with things was such a magical experience. And I just think to be able to share that with other people is so amazing. So to have like this excitement in yourself and then see it spark like a little fire that just spreads, or a sneeze, right? That just keeps on moving. Or a yawn that keeps on yawning. Not a sneeze, a yawn, right, is the one that's catching. But also, I think because for very practical reasons, I took some things that I had, bits and bobs that I had lying around. So there's not a huge variety of the things that I've been taking every week in terms of ochre bodies themselves. Some of that Monticello green that you've seen, a lot of ochre, a lot of yellows from Tintic, both hard and soft, or splintery and soft, like some of the similar things. And seeing people work with them every week again and again and having responses to those same things has really defined or opened up a conversation with those particular materials in an interesting way. And continued my thinking about them. But people have just asked such wonderful questions, right? Russell came to office hours and asked me about ritual. And so I started thinking about that. A friend, Bonnie, came and asked about, but wait, I'm a geologist in USGS, and USGS is so wonderful. I've never seen someone critique it the way you're critiquing it, and got me thinking about that. And I'm like, yes, that's right. Let me clarify those thoughts so I can be more intentional about them. So it's really opened up a lot of pathways, gnomes, as you call them, right? Gnomes that enter in and tell us things that we haven't thought of yet through the ochres. I mean, it's just been a lot of fun too.
Yeah, I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sarah is asking what we mix with the pigments to make the paint-like substances. And that's a really good question. You can mix them with any type of binder. I specifically use gum arabic because it's sort of the easiest thing for a non-painter like me to paint with or to know how to use. And I like that it just mixes with water. And I like the way that it moves the ochres on the paper. But you can mix pigment with oil to make oil paints, or tempera, or wheat paste. I know you've explored some wheat paste things, Heidi. You can put it directly into plaster for gesso. You can put it into shea butter and make, rouge for your cheeks. You can put it in any type of binder. If you just mix it with water and paint it onto the paper, it'll dry and then it'll just brush right off. So the binder is what's sticking it. And sometimes binders also address or adjust the color and how that pigment might move on a particular material. A practical question. Any other questions? How are we doing on time, Claire?
I think we're fine. We could go till 1, so we got time for a few more questions. It's only 12:46. Speaking to what you were talking about before, that your work with ochres is blurring time, it seems like it's also blurring space as well, because you're talking about these ochres being born in supernovae, but then who knows where those supernovae originally existed, and then you're gathering ochres from local landscapes in addition to nails from the UK, and so I love that extra aspect to it. It looks like Rachel has a question in the chat. Do you think the gum is what creates the lovely reticulation in your prints?
I don't think so. And maybe Heidi, you'd have to jump in on this too. I think it's the different particles, because I'm not washing or levigating my pigments. And so they're pretty irregular in particle size. And I think that there's some heavy stuff in there and some lighter stuff and some stuff that's going more into solution. And so a lot of that movement is from the material itself, but not necessarily the gum. Would you say, Heidi, is that the case?
Yeah, I think that sounds right. And I'm sure the gum is doing a little bit of something, but it definitely is more how those ochres are moving in their pigment sizes, like you're saying. Yeah.
But Claire, you mentioned the nails from the Thames. And so I forgot to mention those, but I did prop up all the ochre bodies on nails that Jesse is here. Hi, Jesse. It's late for you. It's evening in the UK, but Jesse and I pulled those nails out of the River Thames on the foreshore. And so the River Thames is a tidal river. And when the tide goes out, you can access the shore, and there are just all these layers of mud. And people do what's called mudlarking, where they pull out archaeological things. Somebody was asking me if I felt guilty, and I guess I don't feel guilty taking archaeological, like old nails out of the River Thames. And I'm happy to return them to the UK when they return the Elgin marbles to Greece. That's my response. It's a petty swipe, right? But those nails were just, it's like rocks, like on the edge of the river. It's just piles and piles of these old nails and pins made out of steel, which is iron that has gone through a very specific process. You might even think of it as, dead iron, because the oxygen has been removed. And Heidi, I know you've got a lot of thoughts about the relationships between live and dead iron and ochre and steel, right? But I saw them and they felt like bodies themselves, and they had been in the water for so long, and they had almost started to go back to their ore-like qualities. They were so knobby and started to grow sort of shapes. And so I thought that they had a really nice relationship to the bodies. And I wanted to put them there together also because when I was doing research, I found that ore from Tintic was shipped as far as Swansea, Wales. And so I just thought it was really interesting to have this material that maybe originated in Tintic and went to Wales and was involved in mining there, and the whole industrial revolution that Onya was working with. And I went and visited her at those mines. And then to see that sort of pop up on the river shore and bring that back and put them with the ochres, just to me seemed like this really interesting relationship. But then also, we noticed, Claire, on Friday, was it Friday night? We noticed that some water had somehow made it through the ceiling and dripped onto the exhibit. And I think it's so magical. No, don't worry. It's like really good in this case, because I really think that water was trying to get back to those nails, or that those nails and those ochre bodies were calling the water back to them, because it was just so coincidental that after all this time, those drops would land right on that nail and splash out onto the exhibit. So I actually think that it was a really lovely thing that happened, that the water was trying to find its way back to those nails and to those ochres on the exhibit table. I mean, now I kind of, after we moved the table so that they wouldn't drip, I kind of felt guilty this whole weekend. Like, maybe we should have left the table there and seen what happened when the water would continue to try to reunite with the ochre.
Looks like we have a comment in the chat from Camille. Those nails were like gnomes.
Yeah, they are.
I also, can I state another thing, unless anyone, I mean, we've got time for a couple more questions, but I think Camille was talking about, how this is a story of connection that you're displaying in your work, but it also seems like a story of the observation of existence through multiple forms of existence. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could also distill design process down to observation, right? What it means to observe. And then to process that observation through what you make. I'm really interested in representation as sort of a form of representing something. And perhaps that's what the ochres do, right? They, through their agency, through their color, they represent their being or their history or their geological time. They represent aspects of the sort of interrelatedness of our landscapes. Maybe even when they cycle from, rock to body and back again through the iron cycle, they're representing different beings and forms through that, right? But I think that design is absolutely about observation, and just being aware of the things that you're noticing around you is really critical. Yeah. Jesse asks, how do you feel looking at ochres from a spiritual energy lens differs from looking at them through a hyperscientific tool like an electron microscope? Well, I think it's the person who's looking, right? It's not the thing that I'm looking at, because I look at the images on the electron microscope as a glimpse into this spiritual material that I'm related to, but I'm able to see it in a different scale. Whereas I think a person who is trained as a scientist would possibly look at their images on the microscope or look at the work in the exhibit from a very different lens. But I think that looking at I'm not kind of sure what the electron microscope thing is yet. I did that stuff because I listened to a lecture from Melanie Anchetta, one of our collaborators who does work with Vivianite. and is an expert on Northwest coast uses of pigments. And she does scanning on the electron microscope to sort of source and date and confirm that certain pigments were being used in these art artifacts. And I thought, oh, well, I'm at the University of Utah. I can access a scanning electron microscope. I should see what that looks like. And we did it. And it produced these really interesting images. I'm not sure where that goes yet. I guess I'm interested in the idea of using an equipment like that to create images that then I'm printing on the letterpress, or that then I'm painting on top of. And I'm also interested in a map of a place, a topo line as a representation of a place, and a set of data as a representation of a place, and as a picture of the ochre as a representation, and then the ochre itself on that as representation. So starting to layer all of these different ways of saying these are all the same things from different perspectives. But I guess, to be honest, Jesse, I don't know yet what it means to look at them through those images, other than it's really striking how much they look like the landscape, or how much they look like bodies, how the same forms are repeating themselves at different scales. Yeah. Wow, maybe that's a good place to pause. I'm going to encroach on your facilitation duties, Claire, and I can hang out for a minute if people want to ask more questions. Or my email is elpitha@design.utah.edu, and I will be at the gallery this afternoon from 5 to 7 if anybody would like to join us.